go. Welcome. Okay. Right. Well, so nice to have you, Colin. Nice to have you, Mike. Don't know where everyone else is, but they can watch the recording. So, yeah. We're looking. I figure we're in parts of Matthew that are really well known now. So, and seeing as most people who come to these sessions are reasonably serious in their Bible study anyway, you'll recognise the kind of the verses as soon as you get into them. I've called it unexpected consequences, and part of the reason for giving it a slightly different name to the way we might normally think about it, because it's going to cover the period where Jesus has to rebuke Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. And as you'll see as we go through, I think that the emphasis very often in the way we've read the story and had the story related, we focus on Peter's failure, whereas I think that there is a very necessary developmental step, which actually is not pain-free for Jesus even as he approaches it. But the unexpected consequences are that as we've reached this wonderful pinnacle where there has been an expression freely given, kind of with a sense of the Spirit's revelation in it from Peter, of you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God, and Jesus has affirmed him in that. The passage now starts to shift things. We're going to see eventually, as a outflow of this, as now something has been achieved in the understanding of the disciples who have followed Jesus. And while that's not going to be easy for them to get their heads around right the way through, it causes a change and shift in Jesus, which is eventually going to lead him down to Judea and obviously to the cross itself. So that's the unexpected consequences, just to the point where they've all got to this is amazing, this is who you are, God's right in it. Jesus is now going to have the difficult task of turning around what it means to see the victory of God, or the victory of the Christ. So we're looking at Matthew 16:21 to 28. So it's only 7 verses, or 8 verses, isn't it? So from that time, so it's not an instantaneous thing. And that's often one of the ways we've kind of had it presented. Peter has this wonderful expression of faith, and then suddenly he's kind of he's seeing it all with doubts at the next moment. But it's from that time. So in other words, something has happened, a marker has happened, and what this is now a new season. And from this time, Jesus is now beginning to explain to them more explicitly that he must leave for Jerusalem, so go down to the south, in other words, and to suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be killed and raised on the third day. So that wouldn't have been a single statement in the teaching. I'm constantly amazed, but at the same time I know it myself. Is we like it, if we're watching a biblical drama, we like it when we hear a word that we recognise from the Bible. But the reality is Jesus is walking tens of miles regularly, and it takes time, and it's conversational, and very often the phrases we have recorded in Scripture are either a sample or a summary of the things that have gone on over a much longer period of time. So it's not that Jesus just kind of turns around and goes, well done, Peter, you've had this revelation. Now, just need to tell you, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer a lot of things, chief priests and the scribes, I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to be raised on the third day. And that's the end of the discussion. It's much more that his teaching is now refocusing itself on actually how the victory of God, or the victory of the gospel, the victory of the Christ, is actually understood, not in terms of kind of normally humanly understood kingly successes, but is actually understood in the way in which he approaches and takes on the suffering and the difficulties. But it's nice that we've got this little summary phrase, and he's going to be raised on the third day. I mentioned that because I can remember a long time ago doing an evangelistic open air in so for Mike will remember the days of the summer project, which was when I was doing the summer project, doing some evangelism in Leicester Square. And I got talking to someone, and he had some funny ideas, but he seemed to know the Bible, as we're going through the things. And at one point when I'd said, "Oh, you obviously read the Bible a lot and things like that," he had all sorts of little objections. And his theory, you see, was that that Jesus didn't ever intend to go and die, but he had to change his plans, and that and then he confessed to me that all the things that he had seen and how he put the verses together were revealed to the Reverend Moon. So it turned out he was a Mooney. But it was kind of, it was a great example of how to select some verses and put them together to create an argument. But within this mix, he always used to. This guy was saying, it's only when that new plan for the Messiah was made by Jesus when he goes up the hill and Moses meets him and Elijah meets him, and that's where he decides to head towards Jerusalem. But it's interesting because here's a little mistake, you see, that he made, and therefore it turns out Reverend Sun Young Moon mean, because before Jesus goes up the mountain, which is the next thing we're going to read, and before he has a conflab with Moses and Elijah, he's already talking about suffering and being killed and raised on the third day. So that their whole theological position was he was going to come and be the messianic king that was prophesied and everybody was expecting. But because John the Baptist messed up and should have said that he was the Christ, but because he didn't, he had to wait for his disciples to see it, but that didn't really work. And so they had to redo the plan, you see. But here is Jesus already talking about something that anyway, you get what I'm saying. So I just thought I'd point that out. It's not new. In fact, in John's Gospel, Jesus makes a reference to that it talks about as the serpent is raised in the wilderness, and actually, if you look at the rabbinic understanding of that means a kind of it means something pretty unpleasant. He talks about those sorts of things. They do appear through the gospel, but I always thought it was ironic that Jesus actually says something almost immediately before the moment that they assume that Jesus actually changed his plan and decided to go to Jerusalem and die. Sorry for enjoying my Danish pastry. So something is shifting though, and that's, I think, what Matthew's gospel is trying to get across to us. They've been understanding all sorts of things about how the kingdom works, how grace works, and so on. But now what they're learning is that is not going to be operated from a place of power. And for me, this is increasingly, it's one of those things I don't think any of us fully get when we become a Christian. And we all go through the phases where, won't it be fantastic when we're in charge and there are more Christians in the world than there are non-Christians, and we can be in charge, and then we can tell everybody and force everybody to be kind. But as we've been seeing those hints as we go through the gospel, that actually I don't know if there's that wonderful little verse in Philemon where Paul says, I didn't want you to do the right thing under compulsion. You can't compel someone to be good. You can't force them to be good. It has to be something they freely adopt. So there is, in one sense, that it's a sort of it's a mirage, the idea that you can kind of, as a benign dictator, kind of spread real goodness to people. And as we get hold of that, we realise that therefore somehow victory's got to be seen some different way. And I think that's part of what Jesus is now trying to unfold to the disciples. So Peter, and it's in the context, I don't think we should think of it as a single conversation. I think Jesus is now refocusing, and this is now disturbing to the disciples. Then we know from some of the other Gospels, for instance, actually, is it? But no, I can't. I won't say it because I might get the timings wrong. But we see Jesus kind of as they're growing in their discipleship. Jesus starts to introduce these ideas, which things aren't going to be quite the way you expect them to be. But in this context, then Jesus says, Peter, take him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This will never happen to you." And you can see good intention in Peter. It's interesting that Matthew just calls him Peter. He's up to now, he's often been Simon Peter. But since Jesus said, "Now you are Peter," he just calls him Peter. So Peter takes him aside. So he's still the same person who has understood that it doesn't undermine the truth of the fact that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. But how could he possibly, that person, be rejected by people or suffer but in those ways? And then we read the words, and I've tried to be careful here. So I've hyphenated, but having turned away. All of the I think certainly Luke does as well. So Matthew and Luke, they definitely, and probably Mark does. Just trying to think, have Jesus turning. And if you look at the context, it's kind of twisting. But often the way it's translated, it's almost like that Jesus has turned to Peter. But it's the actual kind of word that's used is much more the idea of turning away. So that's why I've hyphened it. You don't have to put the word away in there, but it implies much more that they're in the conversation. Peter has taken him aside. He's speaking to him. I think, is it in Mark or Luke? It talks about Jesus turning and facing his disciples. So you can imagine here, here's Peter. Here are the disciples, here's Jesus in between them. He turns from one, he sees the other. So it's not that he's kind of walking, thinking kind of down the road and he turns to address them. It's more that Peter is in a conversation as he turns, which makes sense of his words. So having turned away, he said to Peter, get behind me. In other words, by doing so, he's actually turned his back. He's taken his eyes away from Peter and put Peter behind him as he says, get behind me. And I've punctuated this differently. And I may be wrong, but I've tried to work out, I can see no grammatical reason why I have to be. So it seems to me to be more tradition. So get behind me, ! So turn and saying, get behind me. So that will make sense. And then Jesus, we have just the two phrases, an adversary and a stumbling block, and then we have the verb you are to me. And it may be that the verb is the stumbling block, but I don't see that. I've translated the word Satan as adversary, because that's all it means. The Greek word simply means your adversary or an adversary, and it isn't the Satan. It's not got the definitive article. It's not the biggest adversary. But we've always put the word Satan there, and I think in many ways it reflects, if you like, an expectation of religious hardness. Whereas in the turning away to take his eyes away from Peter, as he says, "Get behind me," literally is behind me, shows much more that, if I can put it this way, the struggle in Jesus that the cross costs him. And for me, that observation has always been quite important. I've not particularly seen it here before. I've seen it more recently. But for a long time ago, I remember realizing that the words of Jesus he prays in Gethsemane, where he says, "Not my will, but yours," that there is a genuine struggle. And the struggle is so intense, obviously he sweats blood, which is highly, highly pressured. So it's not kind of like a casual, I know what I'm up to, but I suppose, it would be nice if I could do this, but it's not really a problem because I'm going to go to the cross. That there is a genuine struggle in Jesus' humanity. The cross is not an easy thing to do. And so the turning away from Peter with the get behind me is not a rejection of Peter. It is, if you like, a sense of the challenge and the way in which Peter, like the devil who tempted him at the beginning, is becoming an adversary that actually is something that has some attraction to Jesus in his humanity. Now, I know that's not popular to say, but I personally find it makes more of the cross. It's not that the cross doesn't become an inevitability, a simple thing. So Jesus says, "Not my will, but yours." And then a few verses later, he says to Peter, when Peter pulls his sword out, he's often in the mix, isn't he? He says, "Put up your sword. Don't you understand that if I'd requested, my Father in heaven would have sent a legion of angels to deal with this?" In other words, I could have turned at any point. I could have turned away from facing the cross, because there is genuine freedom in Jesus going to the cross. He knows it is the will of the Father, but he also knows that the Father's will wants autonomy for his Son. And so he has real freedom. And the truth is that if he did ask, the Lord really would have sent a legion of angels and have to deal with things in a different way. I know because I've had people come back to me on this that upsets people. So I'm being real, and because their theological positions is, well, but then that would have ruined everything, and all the prophecy would have been wrong. But God knows everything. It's all been ordained. Everything's been laid out, one thing after another, and it had to happen. So that's can't be the case. But I'm just reading in that context what the verses say. So he could have changed. And here Peter is raising objections which have some merit, and Jesus understands them because there is a real cost. So he calls him an adversary. So we don't have to translate with Satan with a big S. Satan with a little s is just an adversary. You're tempting me right now, just like the devil did at the beginning. So an adversary, a stumbling block you are to me, is the way I put it. Because your thoughts are not the things of God, but the things of men. So again, in his humanity, Jesus would have understood these things, that they would have had real appeal. So it's not a casual thing. I suppose that's really what I'm driving at. I think that's what the turnaround in expectation from we can be good, a bit like Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings, who, when she's offered the ring, she said, I would take it and I would do good with it, but I would become evil at the same time. The trouble is, if you do it just by kind of usurping power to force people to be good, it becomes evil. So we can't do it that way. Therefore, how do you see victory in that humility and self-sacrificing? In the end, it is by the point of going to the extremes of unfairness and going there in a kind and willing way. But that's not a difficult thing to get. That's not an easy thing for us to do at all. It wasn't easy for Jesus to do. And so Jesus said to his disciples, and they say he's turned from Peter, so perhaps now he's looking at them. If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It's just a tiny little thing with again, we have modern punctuation, so you couldn't really say in the ancient world whether that last phrase, take up his cross and follow me, is a kind of an added statement from Matthew, the gospel writer. It's something that we know that writers of people's speeches will often include their own clarifications within the flow, and you can't always tell who's saying what. And the reason I'm just saying that is whether with hindsight now we understand the cross, but there's something whether Jesus actually said something much more about laying down of your life or whatever, and that's been summarized by the cross, but it's not really important. But if anyone desires to come after me, then they're going to have to follow the same way. So if you are my disciples, you're trying to follow me, understand what I'm saying to you now, all the wonderful things you've seen, the healings and the miracles that's happened, the way in which the demonic has to leave when you tell it to. That doesn't mean to say that you're going to sit at the top of a pile and make people like you. It means you're going to have to you've operated in those ways by your submission to the will of the Father, and actually the will of the Father, the way it works, means that it does require you to follow Jesus into his own sacrifice. Paul puts it this way, that where he I can never remember the verse. I remember it's probably in Galatians, because I did that book a bit more seriously and at depth, because it doesn't come out very easily in the English. But there's a book where effectively he talks about his sufferings, that part of the pleasure Paul takes in his sufferings is because then he understands Jesus in his sufferings. There is a kind of an identification in the word. That identification goes both ways. Our identification with Jesus allows us to live in his victory. But our identification with Jesus also means that we find ourselves following him into suffering. So it doesn't mean to say we have to choose to suffer to follow him, but it does mean that those are the kinds of places he's going to go. But whoever might desire to protect his soul life, you'll find... the reason I've double joined the word there is just because the word soul is often used in the English translations in verse 26, but life is used, but they're the same Greek word. And the problem is the word is suko, like we get the word psychology from, and so on. It's kind of that sort of it's the quality of life. No, it's not. It's not the quality of being alive. It's the quality your life has. It's the things that make your life up. So that's why I called it, I thought we'd go with soul life, and then we can use the same word in both verses. So whoever desires to hold on to that. So the qualities of life I've got at the moment, the fact that I'm able to casually buy from Sainsbury's this iced bun, which I'm eating with my tea, that's a nice quality of life. If I want to hold on to that and protect it, you end up losing it. But if you're willing to lose it, on my account, then you're going to find it. But what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? You see, or that's why they normally put soul there, but it's the same word, but loses his life. Or what will a man give in exchange for it? And so that it's that simple thing of the irony of the qualities that we actually want. And I say do this regularly. I've got a session with my university students, so I'm not allowed to kind of preach, obviously, tomorrow. But I regularly kind of will draw this out to them. If you look to pursue happiness, you never find it, and they tend to accept it because you can show it and demonstrate it. Very often the best things in life tend to be achieved by not pursuing them. They tend to be achieved in something that is often sacrificial elsewhere, but then you discover them, kind of those good qualities of life. It's also true of meaning. I've tried to look through some of the secular literature, and all secular literature I've seen can't find a place to understand meaning that doesn't have sacrifice in it. So meaning only emerges in the things that we're willing to suffer some pain and inconvenience and displeasure with, some sort of form of sacrifice. If it comes too easy, it doesn't have any meaning with it. So if you want meaning in life, there is always going to be. And the reason I'm saying that is we now recognise from a psychological point of view that meaning is actually a component of what we call well-being. Slightly different. They changed it from happiness because they recognised it wasn't full enough. They called it well-being, and one of the things that's different in well-being is you need meaning in life. But then you can't have meaning without doing things that are actually inconvenient, and you have to sacrifice for them. See, so that's a modern take on what Jesus is observing here. What would a man give in exchange for his soul life? For the Son of Man, and now here's now an interesting statement, because suddenly there's a fulfillment which has been assumed by the disciples that the journey goes from where I am here, and here's the kind of pinnacle, and everything's okay, and it just kind of walks straight up there. For the Son of Man is about to come in his glory, his Father and his angels, and then he will give each according to his deeds. And we often miss the significance of he'll give according to his deeds. I'll come back to that in a second. And he says, and truly I say to you, there are some standing here who won't taste of death until they've seen the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So a very obvious kind of response to that is to imagine Stephen is there. Stephen, who's listed in the early church as being one of the 70 or 72. And so actually he might be there, standing there right now, who, when he has that vision of the seated at the right hand of the Father. So Jesus has ascended, and as Paul puts it theologically, he's ascended, he sat down, and he gifts to men from that position. And there are various characters in the New Testament who have a vision of that. Get that sense of vision, of course, including Stephen, who then has that vision and then is martyred. So the kind of, if you like, the thing is fulfilled. Now, they are seeing something that Jesus has also prophesied with his own death. When he goes into death, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory and sit at the right hand of the Father. That place of being at the top of the pile, but it is achieved. It is and is acquired by Jesus going into the depths. That he who has ascended has also descended, as Jesus puts it, or as Paul puts it. Don't kind of trivialize grace and judgment, because one kind of is, you don't realize how deep Jesus has gone. One is deny how, this is Romans 10, I'm paraphrasing, or it brings Jesus down. It doesn't go so high if you don't understand where he's got to. So Jesus is painting now a picture, which is probably what they were always expecting, and you will see it, and you won't even taste death until the truth of it has happened, which is also important, because we realise that the throne that Jesus is on. If you think about the throne of judgment, he sits on in an eternal sense, so not a temporal sense. So he is there on the throne of judgment today, but actually in this life we've seen him take on the lowest and go into the lowest first. So you won't see it until you see it coming in his kingdom. And we get within this, because this is the last verse in this chapter, something of the transition teaching-wise that is going on, which is something that those who have followed him for a while are being privy to. It's not something he's teaching publicly, but those who are walking with him are going to have various lessons along the way, which the next week when we look at the Mount of Transfiguration, we're going to see elements and so on of how this process is going to work. But I was just saying to Colin, but right at the beginning, before some of the other guys turned up, he was asking about this role of judgment and reward, and things that are there. And even though we are saved, and we talk about being saved in Christ and by faith, and then we forget about the consequence side. And so I thought I'd finish just by throwing something up that we can't fully unpack. But I want to, because Jesus regularly talks about judging based on deeds. And we say, but we don't get saved by works. It's nothing to do with works. It's purely by faith, you see. So, but what we've done is I was kind of explaining to Colin before, the Protestant Reformation, there's a thread within it that kind of rejected anything that they thought as being Catholic. And we've ended up with something that is somewhat unbalanced and one-sided. This is my humble opinion on these things. There are consequences, and every single book of the New Testament talks about either degrees of punishment or rewards in heaven. So heaven is not the reward. Heaven and hell are not the reward or punishment. But actually, once you've got there is some level of reward, or there is some level of punishment, and that needs to be accommodated in our theological position. I was saying to Colin before, in Catholicism it gets formulated into the idea of purgatory, which I don't think is the case, but I understand the elements of it. It's probably the popular common view of trying to understand this issue of how our deeds have an impact on our future life. And I always found in the writings of people like C.S. Lewis that he seems to understand that that there's not a kind of a freedom from the shame that we may feel for the consequences of what we did on earth as we stand in heaven, and in what I would think of as serious kind of theologies of judgment, those things are captured. But I thought I would illustrate it with a passage from Luke, which I'll bring up, which is taught sometime between Galilee and Judea. It's in the kind of processes they're going down. Now, in terms of how chronologically the Gospels work, we can't say exactly where it fits. But within that flow, so it's about this period, it's about the period where Jesus has turned things around. We read about, Jesus is talking to his disciples. I'll give you more context than just here. And he says, which of you is going to be a good and faithful servant that God puts in charge of his household? And then he talks about, but if that servant says in his heart, so first of all, he talks about a really good, faithful servant who does what he knows he ought to do. He does according to the light and the wisdom he's got. He tries to exercise that as well as he can for the master, and the master's really happy with him. But then he puts it this way: but if that servant says in his heart, "My Lord delays," and then he begins to beat the servants, to eat and drink and to be drunken, then the Lord comes, and it's the ... because I've missed words out, because otherwise it would take up about 5 slides, when he isn't expecting it. And then he will cut him in two and place him with the unfaithful. So here is a very clear statement, which is followers of Jesus that have been given authority, who, understanding the authority they've got, somehow in the process really don't believe it anymore. He's not coming. It's just that, and they abuse their position. These people, and forgive me for saying it, I'm just flagging what's there in the text, they get placed with the unfaithful. But then he talks about, but that servant, a different servant this is now, who knew his Lord's will, but somehow he knew what he was supposed to do, but he didn't prepare, and he didn't really, so he kind of lived it in a half-hearted way. I know what I'm supposed to do. He's not being demonstrably evil. He's not deliberately kind of doing things he shouldn't do, but he just isn't preparing. He's not living out the quality he should. He'll get beaten with many stripes. Well, that's better than being cut in two and counted with the unbelievers, the unfaithful. And he who didn't know, so he's now a third person, he didn't know and didn't do the things worthy of stripes, i.e. bad things, will be beaten with a few stripes. To whomever much is given, of him much will be required, and to him much has been entrusted, of him more will be asked. So that warning of Jesus, and very clear kind of statement that there is some level of responsibility. Now, we can talk about the hyperbole of the way in which the rabbinic writers spoke. It's not a literal cutting in two. What does it mean? It's the unfaithful rather than the ungodly. But it's clearly a lower status. There's kind of almost four statuses here: low status, pretty low status, sort of low status. But equally, Jesus will also talk about rewards. And so there is a challenge in understanding the calling we have has consequences, and there are times when Jesus will call us to follow him, and we will have responses to those things, and we might think, well, it doesn't matter anymore. We're saved by faith. Full stop. That's the end of it. So I'll just do whatever, and in that place we may get tempted just to kind of go along with things and sell out our fellow believers and so on. All I'm really wanting to get across is this that there is something in our identification with Jesus that isn't always going to be easy, and we shouldn't be overly trivial in our minds when we think about it doesn't matter. Because actually that doesn't reflect the teaching of either Jesus or the New Testament. It's more that it reflects a kind of a theological outflow of what was a really important truth, which is our salvation is by faith. So our salvation is by faith, not by works, but that somehow doesn't divorce us from having to face the consequences as we face our Maker and look him in the eye and say, but this is what I did with what you gave me. So that's a bit of a heavy note to end on, but I thought I wouldn't avoid it because it is one of those things that is regularly avoided. So back to what we had: for the Son of Man is about to come in glory. He's there now, his Father and his angels, and he'll give according to his deeds. And so we do actually see. I've talked about this elsewhere because I draw on it from elsewhere. But it says of Jesus that he grew in favour, but the word there is grace. So how do you grow in grace, seeing as it says that the Father pours out his grace without measure on everybody? So how do you grow in grace? Well, actually, somehow the response of our deeds makes a good landing place for that grace from the Father. So I see it in those kind of ways. It's not that we're achieving it by our works, but somehow our response to the grace he gives us means it either bears fruit in us or it doesn't. And so we see that as us growing in grace, growing in godly success, if I can say it like that. And that's an important thing and makes an awful lot of sense, and it also seems incredibly fair, but that opens up doors into places that will take far too long to try and do today. So I'll leave it there and say what questions would people like to ask at this stage, or comments or statements.